I'll make you a burger that's without animals, or I'll have a replacement for your sugar that is more healthy, or I'll have for you a fiber or functional ingredient. Now, when you're a food company and your margin is 30% and you're just trying the whole time to take it a bit up and have a bit more margin, and somebody comes and says, I'll have a huge benefit for you, but guess what? It just costs 2x. That's it. The conversation is done. There's no chance you'll work together.
Hi, Gil. It's a pleasure to have you on the platform. I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Moshe, for having me. It's a pleasure joining you guys.
It's very exciting. I've had the great pleasure of working with you, even sitting with you in a boardroom, and I've heard many great things prior to us meeting. You're considered a very dominant veteran in the food and beverage industry, anything that has to do with innovation, really scaling large products from very large companies. But just to take a step back, I'd love to hear a little bit about yourself, and then we'll take it on from there.
As you cited, I've done most of my career in the food industry. I went in 2004 to do my MBA in Kellogg Northwestern in the U.S. Well, I always like to say that while all my classmates had a dream to work in Goldman Sachs or McKinsey, I actually had a dream to work in the food industry. Now, I don't actually come from any food background. My family doesn't own a bakery, or I was never a chef in my hobby time. I just was looking for a very large industry that touches everybody's lives on a daily basis. It didn't go through a change or disruption yet. And the food industry looked like a really good fertile ground. The other piece is the food industry has a beautiful, very long value chain. So if you're interested in general management, from R&D to manufacturing, to distribution, to marketing, post-consumer, that's one of the only industries that actually has such a long value chain that is quite complex. So at the end of my studies, I joined Pepsi in the US, learned from some of the best, worked on huge brands, Tropicana, Quaker Oats, Gatorade, and some others. And from there, I actually moved to Switzerland and joined a competing company called Kraft Foods, which at the time was the second largest food company, just when they acquired Cadbury's. And within one night, they became also the largest chocolate company in the world. And basically, I was part of a small team that dealt with the integration of that acquisition. It was very large on a global scale, but actually started working globally, entering new markets, launching new products, innovating. I know you as a fund are actually very active in Asia, and that's your kind of one of your core focus. And actually, I was fortunate enough, I said in Switzerland, but most of my work was in emerging markets, a lot in Asia. So I was working a lot in China, and was working in Southeast Asia, in other regions. Did that for a few years, kind of traveled around the world, learned about consumers, launching new products, entering new markets, dealing with M&A. And then slowly started noticing that the world of food is changing. And suddenly there's this new exciting segment called food tech, of entrepreneurs coming from other industries, if it's from material science, biotech, even pharma or AI, and trying to take their know-how and skills into this humongous industry called agri-food, which is an $8 trillion industry, but has not been really disrupted so far. And started looking at that and saying, wow, there's something big happening here, and try to kind of push Mondelez. Kraft became Mondelez after a few years to enter that space. It took a bit of a while. We basically, in around 2017, which is also pretty much the period I moved back into Israel after many years being abroad, we launched a special team in Mondelez called SnackFutures, which was really the cutting edge of large food companies. That is kind of like, it's almost like their SWAT team that both did venture investments into early stage startups, but also incubated new businesses for the company. I did a few things there. Among them, at the end, led our agri-food tech investments, including doing two exciting investments in Israeli startups. And last year, after taking all this corporate experience and having an amazing ride, I felt like it's the right time to move on and build something by myself. And moved on to build Flora Ventures, which is an early stage agri-food tech VC that invests into Israeli, European early stage startups. So that's kind of myself in a nutshell, but, would love to go into more details.
I'll tell you what, it really sets the stage for what I'd really like to double click on. And that's first of all, the emergence of many food tech startups here in Israel, and incubators and so forth that are looking to disrupt different industries. Ultimately, some of these young startups obviously aspire to become, Kraft Foods or Mondelez or Hershey. Others are they're there to disrupt a very niche aspect of the market, and then ultimately looking to either be bought out or basically to start selling to these large Fortune 500 companies. And I've been really fascinated by how these large Fortune 500 companies think about innovation. And there's many things that I think make innovation very complex for these large organizations. And I'd really like to get a better understanding of how these large corporations approach innovation. How do they balance between their legacy and really disrupting? How do they balance between building out the innovation internally versus reaching out and building out innovation through acquisition? So I'd really love to hear about your experiences in those.
No, that's really interesting, your question here. So the food industry or the agri-food industry has gone through a lot of change. Historically, it's an industry that's consolidated, big players buying other big players and becoming bigger and bigger conglomerates. And most of them have, I give a lecture sometimes about innovation. I always say that they all unfortunately have an innovation playbook, which is something called stage gate, that was invented in 1986 by a Canadian professor, and we're in 2024, so it's a long time still using the same innovation model. That's not very innovative, and really the innovation model of almost all these large food and agriculture companies, and they give different names to that stage gate, but it's always the same. It's basically creating a funnel of ideas and constantly mitigating the risk, giving that project owner and that innovator, that team, a bit of resources, telling them, prove me a bit that you've made a bit of progress, you reduced a bit the risk, and we'll give you more resources and more. Now, that process is very good for large scale innovation in your core categories, in your core businesses. So I'll explain. Let's say Mondelez is the largest chocolate and cookie company, biscuit company in the world. It owns one amazing brand called Oreos. I'm sure you've heard and eaten some. We all love it. And Oreos is like a cash cow. Oreos, if you just go and create a new Oreo flavor, and it's a good flavor, you could probably make $15-20 million a year just with that. Now, I don't want to undermine it, but it's not very difficult. It's not very complicated. It's not very disruptive. Now, that's the majority of the innovation of these large food companies, especially the branded ones. There's actually line extensions, flavor extensions, packaging extensions, things that are taking the core of the business and just extending it a bit. And for that, you can go and do that stage gate. You have like a roadmap. It's almost, you can do this. You have a whole machine that knows how to do that very well in these large corporates. Where it becomes more interesting and more complex is when these large companies want to move into a new space. It could be an adjacent space. So I'll give an example. Again, Mondelez, large snacking company, sells packaged goods, but what happens when it wants to go into a new aisle? For example, it wants to move into fresh baked goods like cakes, croissants, whatever that is. I'm just giving that. That's a completely new category. You don't know how to do it. You don't know which brand. You don't know how to manufacture. And then here, when you go in that space, or I'll just give another example. When I was in SnackFutures, we were very keen to move into health and wellness, into more healthy snacking. And we were very keen to build a category around vegetable snacks. So there, you basically have a question internally that you need to ask yourself is, what is the right way to do it? And I always like to say, I always use the analog of coming with a toolbox, like a handyman that has a toolbox. He has a hammer, he has a screwdriver, and you need to decide what is the right tool you use. We had several tools in our pocket or in our kind of handy box. We had the initial one is M&A, like you mentioned. M&A is an amazing tool that actually a large of food companies are good at. Specifically, Mondelez is great at. They wanted to move into healthy snacks. It's snack bars. They went and bought around 2 years ago Cliff Bars, which is a huge snack bar player, as an example.
Wait, let me take you a step back.
Yes.
How would you say what's the motive behind, meaning these things, like you said, they're well-oiled machines. Some of these companies have been producing the same chocolate for 100 years.
Right.
What's the motive behind, walk into unfamiliar territory?
Again, every company has its strategy, but I would say in general, most of the, at least the more strategic companies are not completely going into something completely on a tangent, right? They're looking to adjacent categories. So again, The example of Mondelez, obviously I don't work there today, but when I was there, largest snacking company in the world, plays in chocolate, biscuits, cookies. But guess what? There's a humongous category called snack bars. Like Cliff bars, Kind bars, all these snack bars you put in your bag. Mondelez didn't play there. They have a big hole in their portfolio. So a lot of times is, and every good company is looking for new growth engines. So you have your core business, but you're looking for new categories you can go and new businesses. It can be very incremental. Let's remember, if I go and do a new Oreo flavor, it might make $15 million, but the incrementality would be tiny because everybody's buying is buying that new flavor instead of the old flavor they like. But if I go into a completely new category that is adjacent, like snack bars, everything I sell is 100% incremental. So one is growth engines, but second is consumer preferences and changes. Again, Mondelez sits in snacking. Most of its snacking, unfortunately, is not the healthiest. It's more in the indulgent space, a lot of sugar. The world is moving into more healthy snacking. Consumers are demanding healthier snacks with less sugar, demanding benefits and efficacy. Regulatory bodies around the world are pushing against less sugar. So if you're a company and you want to prepare for the future, you probably come and say one day, hey, I want to move into categories that are a bit healthier. I need to start preparing for that. Those are some of the examples of why you would do that. The M&A is the original tool that most of the big companies have. Sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it doesn't. But, that works when you have somebody to buy. So in Mondelez, we used to have the M&A, but when we created SnackFutures, part of our thesis was there are some emerging spaces that we know snacking the best. An example is vegetable snacks. We believe that the same like people like eat fruits on the go. For me, a banana is a snack on the go, but you don't have any vegetable on the go. The only vegetable you won't see anybody going on the street and eating a tomato. The only vegetable on the go is probably a carrot. Right. But can you create snacks, real snacks out of vegetables? It's healthy, it's tasty. People want to eat more vegetables because they're not eating them as much in their meals. So if we have that thesis and we go and ask, can we buy somebody? Guess what? It's an emerging space. There's nobody to buy. They're tiny players, but nobody to buy. So here we can make one or two decisions, other decisions that we create new tools in our toolbox, which is, can we make venture investments? Can we find an early stage company that is maybe not huge, but is starting to play there and view them as an investment that maybe later on, if they grow nicely, we'll buy them. That's one opportunity. And the second we had at the time is incubating. So we went and said, you know what, we don't find anybody. We believe in this space. Let's incubate a business here. So those were some of the tools we had in our toolbox. And that's in general my recommendation for large companies that want to grow is you need several tools. You can't use the same trick the whole time. It doesn't fit for purpose for everything you do.
So what are some of the more emerging trends that you see that are impactful on the food and beverage industry these days?
Yeah. So, the food industry, first of all, it's an exciting industry. It's going through a lot of change. I think we're seeing a few really interesting things. First of all, we're seeing space that I've kind of been a fan for several years, and I finally see it kind of catching up now, which is food as medicine. So basically kind of blurring the lines between food and what pharma can do. Today, consumers are less interested in having pills. They're less interested in actually injecting things. They're eating anyway. They would like their food to provide what they need from a nutritional or health perspective. Now, that means, of course, as a beginning, eating healthy foods, but it also means, can you have food that has more efficacy? Even on the verge of having clinical trials. So, we see some really interesting emerging ingredients like collagen becoming very big. By the way, in Asia, it's huge also for beauty care, but also in food. We're seeing a topic of ingredients around functional mushrooms in the tropics. So that's one space. I think the second space, we've all heard recently, I don't know how much you followed, but around the world, one of the biggest trends in the world in general today is what is called GLP-1, those injections that are basically for weight reduction. That's pretty much made now some of the pharma companies kind of that have those solutions kind of skyrocket from a share price. But food and supplements are actually the best enabler for weight loss. So we're starting to see the lines blurring between supplements, over-the-counter drugs, food, and pharma. And that's a really very exciting emerging space. So that's one. I think the second one, from an investment perspective and transformation, is digitizing the value chain. So the agri-food tech industry is in the top 5 largest industries in the world. It's like an $8 trillion industry. Based on a lot of studies done by McKinsey and others, it's the least digitized industry from all the large industries. This is an industry, and that's, by the way, a great fit for Israel as an ecosystem, that didn't go through technological disruption yet. AI, big data, image recognition. And you have here, remember what I said at the beginning, why I came to this industry, you have this very long value chain. So you have a lot of use cases that you can build companies of just tackling different parts of that value chain. So that's a second part that is becoming very big. And the third one, which is more on the agriculture side, is actually more sustainable agriculture. One of the biggest notions everybody understands now is we have a bigger world and population we need to feed. Today, agriculture is very inefficient. Either we lose a lot, there's a third of our food gets wasted, either for post-harvest up to the consumer. But actually, some of our practices over the years with chemicals, etc., fertilizers, pesticides, were not environmental friendly, and we've ruined the soil, etc. So today you start having really interesting models of a trend called regenerative agriculture and soil health, of how do we create agriculture that is both very productive, but actually good for the soil, that we can go on feeding, this growing population, but actually also not ruining the planet. So those are some of the exciting spaces that are happening in the industry. And also they excite me as an investor in the space.
It's so interesting that you see, like what you mentioned about medicine and these companies. You're going from companies who are creating, like you said, Oreo and Toblerone and all these very large, delicious and sinfully delicious brands, could potentially shift into sort of like a medical aspect to that. If you talk about shifting from one industry to another, just shifting from carrots to tomatoes is probably not an easy shift. Like how easy do you think it is for these companies to shift into
it's not easy, but it's it takes I'll give a good example about a different company, by the way. That's where I started my initial career in the industry. I did my first gig into the food and beverage industry was a summer internship as an MBA in the US in Nestle. And Nestle, which is the largest food company and beverage company in the world by far, has a whole division called Nestle Health, which is separate from the core and is exactly working on that kind of middle space. Now, it's interesting, by the way, if we talk about tectonic changes, is the food industry, low margin, huge scale, not a lot of IP, is slowly, some of those companies, not all of them, are starting to think, can I go a bit up the value chain? Can I start selling products that are more IP protected, that have more efficacy and studies around them, that maybe I can get new business models of licensing, etc., and have high margins and high price point. By the way, that's kind of not the whole way till pharma, but there's a whole middle ground, supplements, medicinal foods, over-the-counter drugs, all of that. On the other hand, all the pharma companies, or some of them, maybe it's more to say, are saying, we're in this industry that it takes 10 years to develop a new medicine, a lot of failed trials. We can't, a lot of them are based on one or two kind of blockbuster developments that are saying, can we create things that are much easier for us, that have less regulation, that can be faster to the market, require less R&D, and have more scale. But, so what I'm trying to say is, this is my own thesis. I believe, this is going to take time, and it's not all the companies, and you still have a food industry and pure pharma, but there is going to be developed a third kind of industry or category, which is this middle ground between these two industries today. And that's one of the most interesting industries I'm very keen on building and investing in. And I think even just seeing that huge boost now of weight management and weight loss through pharma, I think is a good indication that's going to move into the food industry.
It's fascinating. I'll tell you, the very large food and beverage companies, they're really recognized by their brand. They're not IP protected as they really have very strong brand recognition. Like you can't go through a Super Bowl without seeing several advertisements for these large for these large brands. But you're saying they're exploring a shift between the brand recognition to something really, really special. How do they How do you think they're approaching these things? Are they trying to build it out themselves? And mostly, and I think even more interestingly is how long do you think this process takes for these companies?
To develop in-house new kind of incremental businesses and innovation, or
Yeah, yeah, or even for them to either implement them internally or identify this company, acquire it, and then really
right.
turn it into a very large
Right.
brand.
Yeah. So one important piece to say, obviously, because I came originally from the kind of consumer packaged goods side, although today I'm more on the tech side of the food industry. There is a whole industry in the food side that is B2B and not branded, right? So there's a whole value chain of humongous companies, ingredient suppliers, processors, distributors, retail. I mean, there's a whole world there. And some of the largest companies in the world, like Cargill, DSM, Givaudan, all of them play in that space. But on the branded side, I would say, it really depends. I mean, I think the original process is quite long. That's part of the antiquated part in the food industry that still needs to can be digitized and much faster. And it's, I would say, a typical innovation process or a new segment in an industry you want to go into in the food industry is a good, I would say minimum 2 years, but actually more on the 3+ years. But I think part of the change today, and consumer preferences are changing so much, trends are moving so quickly, that those large companies understand they need to move faster. And again, those are some of the tools. Let's say when we developed SnackFutures, was separate from the company. The company had their old traditional process that still runs and runs well, to kind of run the ship with that kind of stage gate from 1986. But then there was this separate process that was much more agile and quick that we used to do on the SnackFuture side. So I think the companies are understanding they need to become more agile. I would also say that when they acquire today, in the past, when you would acquire a company in the food industry, you would immediately integrate it into the big machine. Today, after a lot of failed attempts by most large, they understood that actually part of that secret sauce of those companies they bought, even if it's a company that is $1 billion sales, it's better to keep them separate and to gradually integrate them, but still enable it to keep its kind of culture and innovation, etc. Because many times when you integrate it, you just ruin what made it so successful.
What would an integration look like? So let's say you're talking about Mondelez, they bought out Cliff Bar. I think it was
Right.
in 2022 or something like that.
Yeah.
So what do? They have that company continue running as a separate
Yeah. So
identity?
I think in the past it would be, like a plane of executives shows up and pretty much says, we're the owners and welcome in, and start integrating immediately. Today it's different. So I think in Cliff as an example, Cliff still sits in California. It has its own offices. It's separate, has its own brand, has its own team. Yes, obviously there are some stuff that has to be integrated very quickly. For example, financial reporting and some of those things. But I think trying to still keep that kind of spirit as a separate division works quite well. And that's usually how they're doing it today. And trying to also find the easy win. So kind of let it keep what it had. It's successful, but we always kind of talk about it, the best of both worlds of the big and small. Ken and Mondelez, for example, I'll give a good example. Mondelez also bought a company in the US called Hugh Kitchen, or Hugh. It was a very successful company that started in New York, grew much smaller than Cliff, but still growing very quickly. And the place where Mondelez was able tremendously to help them is procurement. When you're a smaller player, you need to procure your ingredients, especially if you're a premium player, they're very expensive. Guess what? Mondelez has big scale. When they call a supplier, the supplier gives a much better price and competitive terms than when it's somebody smaller. So those are some of the examples, but you try to bring the best of both worlds for that integration to be successful.
I was speaking to an owner of one of the largest snack companies in Southeast Asia, and I asked him what he was interested in, and he said, "Listen, we're a very, very low margin business. We really make our money on scale. Anything that could reduce costs, I'm into exploring." Would you say that that really reflects the industry as a whole?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's part of the challenge of the agri-food tech investment space a bit, and startup space. And I say that as an investment in the space. The food industry is tough. It's a huge industry. I told you all the great opportunities and scale and disruption. But going back to my point about food versus pharma, low margins. most of what we see in the agri-food tech VC startup innovation world, most of those inventions, you know them well as an investor, you're invested in some, but they're still small at small scale, and they can't compete on the price with the mainstream player or ingredient or technology. Usually they're a premium. Usually it's something that goes and says, I'll make you a burger that's without animals, or I'll have a replacement for your sugar that is more healthy, or I'll have for you a fiber or functional ingredient. Now, when you're a food company and your margin is 30% and you're just trying the whole time to take it a bit up and have a bit more margin, and somebody comes and says, I'll have a huge benefit for you, but guess what? It just costs 2x. That's it. The conversation is done. There's no chance you'll work together. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of those earlier stage companies. It's true in every industry, but in some industries, you have the ability to price much more, and you have to start with a big margin. Here, you can't. If my snack bar costs $1.99, or my chocolate bar, I can't suddenly come and charge $2.99. You understand that with those prices, the consumer even remembers. Even if you change 2 cents, they remember. So that's been one of the biggest challenges for the industry. And I think I always tell companies and startups, if you can show, you don't need to come from day one, but if you have a roadmap to come to price parity, or if you want to be the gold standard, even cheaper than what you're replacing or competing or doing better than in the industry, you're going to have an amazing business. But if you're not there, it's going to be a big challenge.
So that's a very interesting point. You're saying that these startups that are innovating and trying to disrupt whatever their domain they're playing in should really have their eyes on ultimately how to, obviously being disruptive, but also how to reduce the costs for these large corporations.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It seems like sometimes some of them get lost in really the excitement of breaking or really coming up with something amazing. But
totally, it's a great point. That's I always like to talk, when I talk about industry, I talk about something called agri-food tech 1.0 and 2.0. And I feel like in the last year, and some of the changes in the market that are tough for everybody or across the board are actually a good thing, because in agri-food tech 1.0, which was kind of the maybe the golden age of all these startups, etc., probably from kind of 2017 until a year ago, everybody fell in love with the disruption and the technology and the science. And every industry in food is big, because remember, it's an $8 trillion industry. So if you just go to one segment, you'll say, oh, I'm disrupting a $500 billion industry. Sounds huge. That's true. But I think today there's an understanding is the science is great, the disruption is great, but let's talk about the business. Can you, not from day one, but is your technology one that can actually has a real feasible, clear roadmap in the near to medium term, not 10 years, that it can be competitive on pricing and scale? And if not, that's a challenge. By the way, that's one of the big resets that is happening these days on the cell-based industry, and especially in meat. There's a lot of articles and conversation, but that's also partially also the fault of investors. They had unrealistic expectations. So I think actually the discussion today is much healthier from a business perspective on those topics.
So I'll tell you, there's something I'm really curious about, and just really building off that point is really can't wrap my head around the economics behind the sort of climate initiatives that these large corporations are pushing forward to, meaning combining that idea that they're playing on such low margins, and that even the disruptive angles that they're taking are really need to be ultimately meet those cost saving targets. It seems like when they start going into the climate sort of wrappers that could dissolve and don't really hurt the environment, which is very important, but how could they explore that while justifying it economically? Did you have any insight into that? I'm really curious.
Yeah, so I'll say the one thing, and we briefly touched it when we talked about what makes you move an industry, category, is the one big thing. It's true in every industry, but in food and agriculture, it's happening today in an accelerated way, is consumer demands and regulatory changes. So today, companies across the board, but food is probably one of the most influential one in that space that has the most pressure. Is companies are in the past you were just responsible for your product. You didn't really care about the value chain. If your ingredient came from somewhere that is not sustainable, or there was child labor or deforestation, or it's coming from maybe partners that are doing stuff that is maybe not ethical from one way or another. Today, consumers are expecting you to know that. If I'm a brand and I'm selling a chocolate bar, even if I don't grow the cocoa, the expectation is I'll know everything about those cocoa beans from the day they were planted. But the second one is from a regulatory perspective. One of the big changes that is happening in Europe and some other regions is what is called the Scope 3, which is you're responsible not only for your impact from a sustainable perspective or ESG perspective, etc., but actually on your entire value chain. So again, the cocoa example, even if I don't grow cocoa, I'm responsible for what my cocoa farmer, he's not my farmer, he's a farmer I maybe buy from, is doing. And that change has led companies to really need to reshift their business, to be much more transparent and know what's going on in their value chain. Now, specifically, you talked about packaging the same. There's a lot of regulation happening, moving to packages that are basically much more sustainable, recyclable, etc. So you're right. A lot of these things are less economical. Going back to our margin discussion, the main difference here than a food tech invention, which is I'll get your ingredients slightly better, which I'm not undermining. It's an amazing, I'm very bullish about that segment as well, is the main difference is that those things are, the companies don't have choice. So it's a bit like in, the world of finance and banking, when banks were asked to do KYC, you have to put regulatory the companies don't have a choice. So yes, they are going to take a margin hit, but it's not a question if I want to do it or not. There is regulation, there is consumer shifts happening that they just have to jump and start doing them. And some of them are, making commitments around net zero commitments and etc. So I think that's part of what's happening. But also, you're right, there is also a lot of greenwashing going on in the background. There's a lot of people using this just to say things they're going to do, but they don't really do them. And that's a whole different discussion.
Final question, say I'm an Israeli food tech, agri-tech company building out something disruptive, and I'm trying to engage with these large food, beverage, agriculture companies. What's the best way to approach this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I get this asked a lot because when I was on the Mondelez side, etc., part of my background, and it's still what I do today, I'm a big believer of connecting startups and corporates. And by the way, I'm a believer in general in that thesis, and I know that's part of also your amazing podcast here. But in food and beverage, I even believe in agriculture even more, because we said it's a tough industry. So because it's a tough industry, actually it's even more important that startups engage with corporates early on to get market validation, to expedite processes, etc. Maybe they don't need to go through the whole regulatory process or manufacturing. Their partner can do it, but you need to know how to do it. So some of the advice is, first of all, find the right corporate, meaning there's a lot of corporates out there. There are corporates that are known to work really well with startups, and there are ones that are known to not work with startups. Don't waste your time on those, because probably you're not going to have success. So try to go to places that know they have the expertise in the team. They've done it before. They practice it, etc. That's one. Second, I'm a big believer of be careful. Work with corporates that really want to work with you. I mean, sometimes startups knock on the door, so motivated on the corporate. The corporate tells them, "Yeah, send me some samples," or "Yeah, let's do a small POC." They don't. It's not really on their priority list. You as a startup, that's your life. You're putting all your resources. You're talking about that partnership with that corporate. While in the corporate, it's in the bottom of their list. One way to solve for that is, I'm a big believer of asking for seriousness fee. Is ask a corporate to pay you just a bit, even if that's $50,000, which for a corporate, or 30, it's nothing. But that's a seriousness fee. If that corporate working with you in a small initial project is not willing to pay even a dime, that's usually, I'm not saying ask money from call number one, but if it's becomes something a bit more serious, if they're not willing to pay, that means they're not serious. So I think that's the second one. And, the third one is, I'm a big believer of, setting up clear KPIs. What is success? What is failure? How do we assess it and evaluate it? Because so many times we work together and then one of them says it was a success, the other one is a failure. Talk about that before, so you have that clarity before. So those are some of the advices. And the last one is get to the right person. And that's probably the hardest. Corporates are so big. Just maneuvering and finding the right person is so hard. Even when I was in the company, sometimes I had a hard time finding the right person in the company while I was, an executive in the companies. My advice is usually for startups, Mike, from my experience, is either the venture investment team or the open innovation team, or there's a scouting team. Or just try to ask around, ask other startups that work with them, ask other VCs that partner with them, and try to have a warm intro for somebody that knows them. It always helps in life and